If you look at the photographs of American generals in World War II, you see legends frozen in time. You see Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander. You see Omar Bradley, the soldier's general. You see George S. Patton, the warrior aristocrat with pearl-handled pistols and an ego to match. They were brilliant, disciplined, and immortalized in history books. But there was another general who walked those same battlefields. A man who led from foxholes instead of headquarters. A man who swore like his soldiers, drank with his men, and treated military regulations like kindling. His name was Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. And long before his own troops would raise Tommy guns to defend him against Patton himself, the United States Army had already tried to throw him away. Terry Allen was born with gunpowder in his veins. His father was a colonel. His mother was the daughter of a Spanish officer. The military was his birthright. But West Point didn't care about bloodlines. It cared about conformity. And in 1912, Terry Allen was failing spectacularly. He struggled with a severe stutter that turned classroom recitations into public torture. While other cadets were memorizing Clausewitz, Allen was throwing punches behind the barracks. He flunked mathematics. He flunked ordnance. And finally, the academy had seen enough. In his sophomore year, Terry Allen was summoned to the commandant's office and told to pack his bags. Discharged, flunked out, finished. For most men, that would be the end. They would slink home, find work selling insurance, and spend the rest of their lives wondering what might have been. But Terry Allen wasn't most men. He refused to let the Army's rejection be his final chapter. He clawed his way to the Catholic University of America, earned a degree, and forced his way back into the military through a competitive examination, earning a commission as a second lieutenant in the cavalry. He had entered the Army through the back door, carrying a chip on his shoulder the size of Texas and a promise carved into his bones. They would never forget him again. Then came 1918, the Great War. While the polished officers sat in staff tents drawing lines on maps, Captain Terry Allen was choking on smoke and blood in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, leading a battalion of the 90th Division through German machine gun fire. This was where the rebel of West Point finally found his true classroom. The lesson came on a fog-choked morning during a savage assault on German trenches. Allen was leading from the front, a habit that would later unsettle even his superiors, when a German bullet punched into his face. The round shattered his jaw and ripped out several teeth. Blood poured down his uniform. Medics screamed at him to fall back. But Allen stayed on the line, issuing orders through a mouthful of shattered bone, refusing evacuation until the objective was taken. That moment told you everything you needed to know about Terry Allen. He wasn't built for parades or protocol. He was built for war. And in World War II, that unbreakable defiance would bring him face to face with the most feared general in the American Army, and turn a desert command post into the site of a near mutiny that could have changed history. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. By 1942, Terry Allen had proven himself in combat. He'd survived rejection, bullets, and the brutal proving grounds of 2 wars. The Army brass, despite their reservations about his rough edges, couldn't ignore results. They needed fighters, not parade ground performers. So they gave Allen a command that would either make or break him. The 1st Infantry Division. The Big Red One, America's oldest and proudest division. Most generals would have seen it as an honor to be treated with reverence. Terry Allen saw it as raw material. He threw away the manual on day 1. No more pressed uniforms. No more spit-shine boots. No inspections for creases or salutes. Allen didn't care if his men looked like recruiting posters. He cared about one thing. Could they kill Germans and come home alive? "I don't give a damn about polish," he told his officers. "I care if they can shoot straight and move fast." He didn't lead from behind a desk. He lived in the mud with his troops, ate cold rations beside privates, drank whiskey with sergeants in smoky tents, cursed like a dock worker. When his men saw their general sleeping in the same freezing foxholes, sharing the same filthy water, bleeding the same red blood, they stopped seeing stars on a collar. They saw one of them, and they would have died for him. Allen built trust the old-fashioned way, through shared misery and mutual respect. He knew their names. He knew their hometowns. He knew which ones had kids waiting back home and which ones were running from something. When a soldier screwed up, Allen didn't court-martial him. He put him on point the next patrol and told him to earn his way back. The big red one transformed under his command. They became ferocious, unpredictable, and utterly loyal. They fought like wolves, vicious, coordinated, relentless. German intelligence reports began flagging the division as particularly dangerous. Soldiers with a red number 1 patch weren't just combatants. They were fanatics. But back at Allied headquarters, different reports were circulating. Reports of drunken brawls, looted supplies, insubordination, a division that won battles but broke every rule doing it. The big red one was feared by the enemy and hated by the brass. Allen had forged them into the deadliest weapon in North Africa. But he'd also created his own Achilles heel. Because the same wildness that made them unstoppable in combat made them uncontrollable everywhere else. And in the rigidly hierarchical world of military command, that made them, and their general, a problem waiting to explode. Early 1943 brought nothing but bad news from North Africa. American forces had been bloodied at Kasserine Pass, humiliated by Rommel's Africa Corps, and left wandering the desert like a beaten boxer looking for the corner. Morale was in the gutter. Discipline was worse. Soldiers wore whatever they could scavenge. Officers made excuses. The entire II Corps looked less like an army and more like a disorganized mob with tanks. Washington needed a fixer. Someone who could take broken units and hammer them back into fighting shape through sheer force of will. They sent George S. Patton. He arrived like a thunderstorm, all gleaming boots, ivory-handled pistols, and barely contained fury. Patton didn't just take command of II Corps, he seized it by the throat. Within days, he instituted mandatory helmet policies, uniform inspections, and fines for soldiers caught without proper gear. Ties became mandatory, even in combat zones. Patton believed that a soldier who looked sharp fought sharp. Discipline wasn't just important, it was everything. Then he visited Terry Allen's camp. What Patton saw made his blood boil. Allen's men looked like pirates. Uniforms mismatched, boots scuffed. Some weren't even wearing helmets. Worse, they'd dug slit trenches and foxholes all around the command post. Deep defensive positions for protection during German air raids. To Patton, those trenches were an insult, a confession of fear. Real soldiers didn't cower in holes. They stood tall and dared the enemy to try. He found Allen and didn't bother with pleasantries. "What the hell is this?" Patton gestured at the trenches with disgust dripping from every word. "You're teaching your men to hide like rabbits." Allen met his eyes, calm but unyielding. "I'm teaching them to survive, sir. Hard to kill Germans when you're dead." The temperature between them dropped 20 degrees. Patton looked at Allen, really looked at him, saw the rumpled uniform, the swagger, the complete absence of military polish. This wasn't a general. This was a brawler with stars on his collar. "You're running a circus, not a division," Patton said coldly. Allen didn't flinch. "My circus wins battles." Two philosophies, two egos, two war dogs straining at opposite ends of the same chain. Patton believed war was won through discipline, image, and iron-fisted control. Allen believed it was won in the mud by men who trusted their commander more than they feared the enemy. Both men were brilliant. Both were proven. And both were too stubborn to bend. The collision was inevitable. The only question was how bloody it would be. The tension between Patton and Allen, it didn't simmer. It festered. Every inspection became a confrontation. Every report from Allen's division came back with Patton's red-inked disgust scrawled in the margins. But Patton was a volcano, and volcanoes don't stay dormant forever. It happened on a blistering afternoon when the North African sun turned metal too hot to touch and sanity into a luxury no one could afford. Patton arrived at Allen's command post unannounced, his jeep kicking up dust as it skidded to a stop. He stepped out, surveyed the camp with those cold, aristocratic eyes, and his jaw tightened. There they were again. Those damned foxholes. Those monuments to cowardice dug into his desert. Allen's staff watched nervously as Patton walked directly toward the general's personal slit trench. The one Allen used during air raids. The one that had saved lives when Stukas screamed overhead and dropped their payloads. Patton stopped at the edge. Then, in front of Allen's staff, in front of his guards, in front of God and the entire camp, he unzipped his fly. Time stopped. Patton urinated directly into Allen's foxhole, a steady stream splashing against the dirt walls, deliberate, calculated, humiliating. When he finished, he zipped up, turned to the stunned officers, and smirked. "There. Now try to use it." Then, silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with rage, disbelief, and something far more dangerous. Violated loyalty. Allen stood 10 feet away. He'd watched the entire thing. His face was stone, but his eyes burned with a fury that could melt steel. Every instinct screamed at him to respond, to defend his honor, to put Patton on the ground where he belonged. But Allen said nothing. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even change expression. His men, however, weren't made of the same iron discipline. Allen's personal guards, hard-eyed veterans who'd followed him through hell, shifted position. Hands moved toward weapons, jaws clenched, eyes locked onto Patton with the kind of cold focus that comes right before violence. The air crackled with unspoken threat. Patton felt it. You didn't survive 2 wars without recognizing when you'd crossed a line. He glanced at the guards, saw the murder in their eyes, and for perhaps the first time in his career, George S. Patton reconsidered his next move. He turned and walked back to his jeep without another word, but the damage was done. Something had broken in that desert. Something that couldn't be repaired with apologies or orders. Patton had humiliated a general, and Allen's men had just decided where their true loyalty lay. Patton didn't leave the area immediately. Whether from stubborn pride or a need to reassert dominance, he lingered near Allen's command post, inspecting vehicles, barking orders at junior officers, making his presence impossible to ignore. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The camp had gone quiet, not the peaceful quiet of rest, but the tense quiet before a storm breaks. That's when Allen's personal guards made their move. They were hand-picked men, combat veterans who'd seen things that would break ordinary soldiers. They didn't speak much, didn't smile often, and they sure as hell didn't forget disrespect shown to their commander. 3 of them approached Patton as he stood near his jeep. Thompson's submachine guns cradled in their arms, not pointed yet, but ready. Patton noticed them coming, started to wave them off with the casual arrogance of a 3-star general who expected instant obedience. Then he heard the sound that changes everything. Click, click, click. Safeties being released. Mechanical and final, like the cocking of fate's hammer. The Tommy guns came up. Not wild or theatrical, smooth, professional, practiced. 3 muzzles, 3 sets of cold eyes. 3 men who had decided that stars on a collar didn't give anyone the right to humiliate the man who'd kept them alive. Patton froze. For a heartbeat, the war stopped. No artillery in the distance, no engines rumbling. Just silence and the electric charge of a decision being weighed in the balance. Patton was unarmed, alone, face to face with American soldiers who had crossed the invisible line between discipline and mutiny, and were standing firmly on the wrong side of it. He looked into their eyes and saw no hesitation, no fear, just iron loyalty and the unspoken question, "Do you want to push this further?" In that moment, George S. Patton, the general who'd slapped soldiers for cowardice, who'd charged across Europe with pistols blazing, who feared nothing and no one, realized he'd finally found his limit. One wrong word, one dismissive gesture, one attempt to assert authority, and those triggers would pull. Patton stepped back, slowly, deliberately, hands visible and empty. He climbed into his jeep without a word and drove away, dust trailing behind him like a retreating army. Allen watched from a distance. He never said a word to his guards, never acknowledged what had happened, never filed a report. But the camp knew. The story spread in whispers. Patton, the unstoppable, the fearless, the legend, had been stopped cold by loyalty's loaded chamber. He'd finally met a line he wouldn't cross, and it was drawn by men defending Terry Allen. Patton never mentioned the confrontation, not in reports, not in his famous diary, not even in private conversations with other generals. But his silence wasn't forgiveness. It was calculation. He didn't need to retaliate directly. The system would do it for him. Allen's division kept winning. They pushed through Tunisia with savage efficiency, breaking German positions that other units couldn't crack. The big red one earned its reputation in blood, enemy blood. But with every victory came whispers from headquarters, whispers that grew louder with each passing week. Reports filtered up the chain of command, bar fights in newly liberated towns, supply trucks mysteriously requisitioned without proper authorization. Soldiers who treated officers from other divisions with open contempt. A swagger that bordered on, or crossed into, outright insubordination. General Omar Bradley, methodical and by the book, began watching Allen's division with increasing concern. Bradley believed in discipline, order, and the chain of command. What he saw in the big red one looked dangerously close to chaos. "They fight like devils," Bradley admitted to his staff. "But they act like bandits." The pressure built quietly, bureaucratically, inevitably. Then came Sicily, July 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Italy's doorstep. Allen and the big red one were given one of the toughest assignments. Troina, a fortified hilltop town that the Germans had turned into a fortress of steel and stone. It was a meat grinder. German artillery turned the approaches into killing fields. Machine gun nests covered every avenue. For 6 brutal days, Allen's men clawed their way up those hills through fire and death. And they took it. Troina fell. The big red ones stood victorious on ground soaked with their sacrifice. Allen had delivered what no one else could, another impossible victory. The next day, he was called into headquarters. Bradley and Patton were waiting. Their faces told him everything before they spoke. "You're being relieved of command," Bradley said, his voice flat and bureaucratic. "Combat fatigue. Combat fatigue." The polite fiction, the face-saving lie. Allen stared at them both. He'd won every battle they'd given him, led from the front while they commanded from maps, bled with his men while they stayed clean, and now they were taking it all away. "Understood," Allen said quietly. No protest, no rage, just cold acceptance. Everyone in that room knew the truth. This wasn't about fatigue or competence. This was about control. About a general who couldn't be broken, couldn't be polished, couldn't be made to bow. Terry Allen had stood up to Patton and survived. But in the end, they found another way to make him pay. The official orders came down on August 7th, 1943. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen was relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division, effective immediately. His deputy, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of a President, Medal of Honor recipient, and Allen's most loyal officer, was fired alongside him. 2 generals, 1 message. The big red one's wild heart was being ripped out. Allen was given no ceremony, no formal farewell, no recognition for the victories he'd delivered. Just paperwork and a transport date. The Army wanted him gone quickly, quietly, before his presence could destabilize what they were trying to fix. But the big red one had other plans. The day Allen left Sicily, something unprecedented happened. Thousands of soldiers, dirty, exhausted, combat-hardened killers, lined the dusty road leading out of camp. Nobody ordered them to be there. No officer organized it. They simply came. They stood in silence. No parade formations, no crisp salutes, no military protocol. Just row after row of men who'd followed Terry Allen through hell and wanted him to know what he meant to them. Allen's jeep moved slowly down that gauntlet of grief. He looked at their faces. Faces he knew, names he remembered. The kid from Brooklyn who'd frozen under fire until Allen talked him through it. The sergeant from Texas who'd carried 3 wounded men to safety. The lieutenant who'd cried the first time he'd killed a man. These weren't just soldiers. They were his family. Many of them were crying. Grown men, trained killers, veterans of horrific combat, standing with tears streaming down their dust-covered faces. Allen climbed out of the jeep partway down the line. He couldn't just drive past. He shook hands, gripped shoulders, looked them in the eyes. His own eyes glistened with emotion he couldn't fully hide. "Keep fighting," he told them, his voice rough. "Win this war." They nodded, unable to speak. Roosevelt stood beside him, equally broken. 2 generals being punished for loving their men too much and giving a damn too little about the shine on their boots. When Allen's jeep finally disappeared down that Sicilian road, the soldiers remained standing. Silent, shattered. Headquarters thought they'd buried Terry Allen's career. They'd sent him home defeated, stripped of the division he'd built from raw will and shared blood. But legends aren't buried that easily, and Terry Allen's story was far from over. The Army sent Terry Allen back to the United States in disgrace, expecting him to fade into obscurity. They assigned him to Fort Lewis, Washington, far from the war, far from glory. His job? Train replacement troops, babysit green kids fresh off farms and factory floors. It was meant to be exile, a quiet place for a loud general to disappear, They underestimated him. Again. Allen was given command of the 104th Infantry Division, a unit composed almost entirely of draftees with zero combat experience. Kids who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. Boys who still wrote letters to their mothers every night. Most generals would have seen it as an insult, a career-ending assignment. Allen saw raw material. He threw himself into training with the same intensity he'd brought to North Africa and Sicily. But this time, he had something the Big Red One never had. A blank slate. No bad habits to break. No traditions to overturn. Just young men willing to learn from a general who'd already proven he could keep soldiers alive. And Allen had learned something crucial from his years of combat. Conventional warfare got men killed. So he taught them to fight unconventionally. He trained the 104th to operate at night, when other divisions were sleeping, when the rulebook said battles didn't happen. No preparatory artillery barrages that announced your position. No loud assaults that gave the enemy time to prepare. Just silence, darkness, and cold steel. Bayonets before breakfast became the division motto. Allen drilled them relentlessly. Night marches, silent communication, moving through darkness like ghosts. Attacking without warning, fading before reinforcements arrived. He taught them that fear was a weapon, and nothing terrified an enemy more than soldiers who materialized from shadows and disappeared before dawn. The 104th Infantry Division transformed under his command. Those farm boys and factory workers became something else entirely. Predators who owned the night. Soldiers who moved without sound and killed without hesitation. They called themselves the Timberwolves, and they meant it. When the division finally shipped to Europe in 1944, German intelligence began filing disturbing reports. Enemy units that attacked exclusively at night. Americans who struck without artillery support, phantoms who seemed to appear from nowhere. The Germans had a name for them, Nachtjäger, night hunters. Terry Allen had been stripped of the Big Red One, humiliated by the brass and exiled to obscurity. So he'd done what he always did when the army tried to break him. He rebuilt himself, reinvented warfare, and turned a division of untested boys into the nightmare that haunted Germany's sleep. The army thought they'd buried Terry Allen. Instead, they'd given him time to forge a new legend in darkness. September 1944. The 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, landed in Europe and immediately proved they were unlike any unit the Germans had faced. They didn't fight like other American divisions. They attacked at 2 a.m. when exhausted defenders expected rest. They crossed rivers in complete silence under moonlight, appearing on the far bank like apparitions. They stormed towns before sunrise, clearing streets with bayonets while the enemy was still reaching for their weapons. The Timberwolves punched through Belgium and crashed into Germany with terrifying momentum. Allen led them the way he'd always led. From the front, in the mud, sharing every risk his men faced. They liberated cities the Wehrmacht thought they could hold. Eschweiler, Stolberg, and then Cologne. By April 1945, the Timberwolves had fought their way deep into the heart of Germany. They reached the Elbe River, the agreed-upon meeting point with Soviet forces pushing from the east. When Allen's troops linked up with the Red Army on April 26, 1945, it was more than a military milestone. It was vindication. The man who'd been fired in Sicily, stripped of command after confronting Patton, sent home in disgrace, was now standing at the tip of the Allied spear, having led his division farther into Germany than almost anyone else. No ticker-tape parades awaited him. No fourth star would ever touch his collar. The establishment never forgave men who colored outside the lines, no matter how many battles they won. But Terry Allen didn't need their approval. His soldiers, the ones who'd followed him through the darkness, who'd learned to kill silently and move like wolves, they knew what he was. When Allen walked through their ranks, battle-hardened veterans looked at him with something beyond respect. They looked at him like a god of war. World War II produced many famous generals. Eisenhower orchestrated from above. Bradley calculated from headquarters. Patton conquered with fury and headlines. But only one general inspired such fierce loyalty that his own troops raised, loaded Thompson submachine guns at a 3-star superior to defend him. Only one general was fired for being too effective, too beloved, too unwilling to compromise his soul for polish and protocol. Only one general got exiled, rebuilt himself in the shadows, and returned to lead the charge into the heart of Nazi Germany. Terry de la Mesa Allen never made it to the top of the military hierarchy. He was too rough, too rebellious, too real. But he did something far more difficult than climbing ranks. He stood up to George S. Patton, survived the consequences, and walked away not as a traitor or a failure, but as a legend carved in loyalty, written in blood, and remembered by the men who would have died for him. In a war full of generals, Terry Allen was the one his soldiers loved. And in the end, that mattered more than all the stars in the army.